A company loses its best engineer to a competitor. A few months later, a second one leaves. The mediocre performers stay for years. If that pattern sounds familiar, you're looking at something with a name, and once you see it, you can't unsee it in every team you've ever managed. It's called the Dead Sea effect, coined by technologist Bruce Webster after he kept observing the same pattern repeat itself across software teams. The name borrows from an actual body of water. The Dead Sea sits at one of the lowest points on Earth, fed by fresh water that flows in and then evaporates in the heat, leaving behind salt, layer after layer, year after year. Nothing much survives in water that concentrated. Apply that image to a company, and the metaphor does almost all the explaining for you. Fresh talent flows in, something in the environment, bad management, a stalled career path, a culture nobody particularly likes acts like the heat, and the strongest people evaporate out, while what's left behind settles and concentrates and never leaves. The logic underneath this is simple, and it's a little brutal once you say it out loud. Talented people have options. A strong engineer, a strong salesperson, a strong anyone can look at a dysfunctional team, decide they've had enough, and get hired somewhere better in a matter of weeks. Their skills are portable. Their reputation travels ahead of them. Recruiters already know who they are. Leaving is low risk because the market has already told them, repeatedly, that they're worth pursuing. Weaker performers face a completely different calculation. They often can't leave as easily. And it's not about effort or desire, it's about market reality. If your skills are middling, the job search is longer, the offers are worse, and the risk of ending up unemployed or underpaid is real. So staying put, even in a team that's clearly struggling, feels safer than testing a job market that might not want you. That's not laziness. That's a rational response to an unfavorable set of options. The strong leave because they can. The weak stay because leaving is a gamble they're not equipped to win. Now run that dynamic forward over time, and you get the Dead Sea forming in slow motion. A top performer leaves. The company backfills the seat, often with whoever's available rather than whoever's exceptional, because urgent openings get filled under time pressure, not ideal conditions. That new hire lands in the same dysfunctional environment that pushed the last person out. If they're strong, the clock is already ticking on their own exit. If they're not, they settle in, the same way the last mediocre performer did. Repeat that cycle enough times, and the team's average skill level doesn't crash all at once. It erodes, one quiet resignation at a time, until one day, a manager looks around a meeting room and can't quite explain why the room feels weaker than it used to. That word quietly is doing a lot of work here, and it's worth sitting with, because it's the actual danger in this pattern. No single resignation looks alarming. People leave jobs constantly, for 100 reasons that have nothing to do with dysfunction. A spouse relocates, a friend refers them to a better-paying role, they want to try something new, HR sees an exit interview, checks a box, moves on. A manager sees one open seat, posts the rec, moves on. Nothing about any individual departure screams systemic problem. That's exactly why it survives so long. A single data point never triggers alarm. It's only when you stack 24 months of departures side by side that the shape becomes obvious, and by then the water has already evaporated quite a bit. Picture a mid-sized engineering team, the kind that exists at thousands of companies right now. Over 2 years, 5 people leave. On paper, that's unremarkable attrition for a team that size. Nobody's going to flag it in a quarterly review. But look at who those 5 people were. 3 of them were the engineers other people went to when something was actually broken. The ones who shipped the hard projects. The ones whose code reviews taught junior engineers more than any onboarding doc did. The other 2 were comfortably average, doing fine, never causing problems, never solving the hardest ones either. Now look at who's still on the team. The comfortably average 2, still there. Plus, whoever got hired to backfill those 5 seats, hired under deadline pressure, evaluated against a shrinking pool of applicants because the team's reputation had already started to slip in engineering circles. The team is still fully staffed. Headcount looks fine on a spreadsheet, but the actual capability of that room has dropped, and it dropped in a way that no single resignation memo would have told you about. It's worth noticing that this pattern doesn't respect industry lines either. Swap engineering team for almost any skilled function and the mechanics hold up identically. A sales team where the top closers keep getting poached by competitors, while the reps who consistently miss quota stick around for years, because the top closers can walk into a new company and start earning commission within a month, while the underperformers know a new employer would just as quickly notice the same pattern their current manager has been tolerating. A hospital unit where the most capable nurses transfer to better-run departments or leave the profession's harder settings for less brutal ones, while nurses who are just getting by stay put because credentialing and scheduling make lateral moves genuinely difficult. A marketing team where the strategist who actually moves metrics gets recruited away within a year of doing visibly good work, while the people producing forgettable campaigns are never quite bad enough to be managed out and never quite good enough to be recruited away. The underlying economics are always the same. Wherever a skill is portable and in demand, the people who have it get to be selective about where they spend their time. Wherever a skill is common or the market for it is soft, the people who have it get to be selective about very little, and staying becomes the default rather than a choice. This is where a lot of management instinct actually works against the manager. Most retention thinking treats every departure the same way: track the turnover rate, benchmark it against industry norms, treat a low number as good news, and a high number as a fire to put out. But a team can have a perfectly normal turnover rate and still be dying from the inside, because the rate tells you how many people left, not who. A 10% turnover rate made up entirely of your strongest performers is a 5-alarm fire. A 10% turnover rate made up of people who were never going to move the needle either way is, frankly, close to irrelevant. Same number, completely different meaning. If you're only watching the aggregate, you're watching the wrong thing entirely. So what's actually driving the strong people out? The root causes, as unglamorous as they sound, are usually predictable. And that's actually good news, because predictable problems are fixable problems. Bad management sits near the top of almost every version of this story. A manager who doesn't develop people, doesn't shield the team from organizational noise, doesn't notice or reward the difference between someone who's coasting and someone who's carrying the team. Stalled growth is another one. Ambitious, capable people want to be moving somewhere toward a promotion, toward harder problems, toward more responsibility. Park them in the same role with the same scope for 2 or 3 years, and you're not retaining them, you're storing them temporarily until a better offer shows up. Lack of interesting work follows closely behind. Skilled people generally didn't get skilled by accident. They invested in getting good at something because they wanted to use that skill on problems that matter. Hand them years of maintenance work and busy work instead, and you've basically told your best people their growth is not the company's priority. And then there's the bluntest one, a toxic culture. Whether that's a specific bad actor nobody's willing to confront, a habit of public blame, or just a general climate where people feel unsafe raising problems. Strong performers, precisely because they have options, are the ones least willing to tolerate that environment. They don't need to. They can leave. It's worth being precise about what stalled growth actually looks like in practice, because it rarely announces itself as a crisis. It's a title that hasn't changed in 3 years despite the scope of the job clearly expanding. It's a promotion conversation that keeps getting pushed to next cycle. It's a strong performer training their third replacement for a role they were supposed to have moved out of a year ago. None of these are dramatic events. They're a slow accumulation of small signals that, individually, a busy manager can always justify postponing budgets tight this cycle. The org chart's frozen. Let's revisit after the reorg settles. But a capable person is quietly doing the math the whole time, comparing what they're getting here against what they could plausibly get somewhere else. And that math doesn't pause just because the manager is busy. Weaker performers, meanwhile, often stay through every one of those same conditions. Not because they're more loyal, not because they believe in the mission more, not because they have some deeper commitment to the team. They stay because the market simply values them less elsewhere. And that harsh economic fact quietly outweighs whatever dissatisfaction they're feeling. Loyalty is a nice story. Market leverage is the actual mechanism. It's an uncomfortable thing to say plainly, but it's the honest version of what's happening, and pretending otherwise is exactly how this pattern goes unnoticed for years at a time. Here's the part that catches most managers off guard, though. And it's the part that turns this from an interesting observation into something that should genuinely worry you if you run a team. It's not that the Dead Sea effect happens. Most people, once they hear the name, nod along and recognize it instantly from somewhere in their career. The part nobody expects is how invisible it stays, even to managers who are actively trying to watch for turnover problems. You can be diligent. You can review attrition numbers every quarter. You can hit every retention target on your dashboard, and you can still be running a dead sea because the dashboard is answering the wrong question. It's telling you how many people left. It was never built to tell you who. This is why exit interviews so often fail to catch the pattern too. Exit interviews happen one conversation at a time, disconnected from each other, usually run by HR rather than the manager who actually needs the insight, and often softened by the departing employee who doesn't want to burn a bridge on their way out. Nobody sits down after the 5th resignation in 2 years and cross-references it against the 4th, the 3rd, the 2nd, and the 1st, asking whether a shape emerges. That analysis requires deliberately zooming out to a time frame most performance reviews never use 2 years, is far longer than a typical quarterly or even annual retrospective, which is exactly why the pattern hides in the gap between how often people check and how slowly the damage actually accumulates. There's also a psychological trap that makes this worse, and is worth naming directly because it's the kind of thing that sounds obvious in hindsight but isn't obvious in the moment. When a strong performer resigns, the instinctive managerial response is almost always personal and situational. They got a better offer. They wanted a change of scenery. They had a life event. Each explanation is plausible on its own, and each one lets the manager avoid asking a much less comfortable question. Was there something about this specific team, under this specific management, that a stronger performer somewhere else wouldn't have to deal with? It's far more comfortable to attribute a resignation to the market being competitive than to attribute it to something fixable inside your own organization. But comfort is exactly what lets the pattern keep repeating. Because if every exit gets explained away individually, nobody ever adds them up. So what actually breaks the cycle? If the standard tools, turnover rate, exit interviews, quarterly attrition review, all miss it, the fix has to start with a change in what you're tracking. Not how much you're tracking. Instead of asking how many people left this quarter, ask who left. And specifically, ask what tier of performer they were relative to the rest of the team. That requires managers to be honest with themselves about who their strongest people actually are, which is its own uncomfortable exercise. But it's a necessary one. Because you can't spot a dead sea forming if you've never mapped where the water actually was to begin with. Then extend the window. Don't judge this quarter by itself. Look back 2 years and ask a very specific question. Of the people who've left, how many were in the top tier of performance, and how many were in that tier within their first 2 years at the company specifically? That early tenure detail matters more than it might seem. A strong performer leaving after 8 years, having grown, been promoted, gotten what they came for, is a very different signal than a strong performer leaving after 14 months. The second case usually means they arrived, quickly diagnosed the environment, and decided it wasn't worth staying for. That's not bad luck. That's information about your organization, delivered by someone who had the market leverage to act on their diagnosis and leave before you even noticed there was a problem. There's a second, quieter layer to this worth building into your tracking, and it's the people who haven't left yet but are showing the early signs of the same calculation. Watch for the strong performer who stops raising their hand for the stretch project, who used to push back in planning meetings and has gone quiet, who suddenly starts keeping their calendar a little more private. None of that is proof of anything on its own. But it's the same evaporation happening earlier in the process, before it shows up as a resignation letter on your desk, and a manager who's already primed to think in terms of the Dead Sea pattern is far more likely to catch it while there's still time to change the calculation, rather than after the decision has already been made somewhere else. And this is really the core distinction the whole idea rests on. The instinct when good people leave is to treat it as a staffing problem. Open the rec, run the interviews, fill the seat, move on. But backfilling headcount doesn't touch the actual mechanism. Because if the conditions that pushed the last strong performer out are still in place, whoever you hire to replace them walks into the exact same heat. If they're talented, they'll evaporate too, on roughly the same timeline. You end up refilling the same leaking bucket indefinitely, congratulating yourself each time on a fast time to hire, while the underlying salinity of the team keeps climbing. The fix has to target the why, not just the who. Why don't your best people want to stay? Is it the growth path, the caliber of work, the management, the culture? Until that question gets answered honestly, every resignation is just another data point in a pattern you haven't admitted you're inside of. None of this means panicking at every resignation letter that crosses your desk. People leave for good, healthy, unrelated reasons all the time, and treating every exit as a 5-alarm crisis is its own kind of overcorrection that burns trust and makes you a paranoid manager instead of a perceptive one. The goal isn't paranoia, it's precision. Track who's leaving, not just how many. Watch the 2-year window, not just the quarterly snapshot. And if your strongest people keep exiting within their first year or two, stop treating each one as an isolated coincidence and start treating it as a diagnostic. Because a team can look fully staffed, hit every headcount target on the org chart, and still be quietly turning into a dead sea full of water, but not the kind anything can actually grow in. Follow along for more ideas like this one.